Coming next, a big welcome to Carmen Ng, Assistant Technical Services Manager from SGS Hong Kong Ltd. And today, Carmen will share her expertise on gaining competitive advantage in electronics with strategic sustainability. And we're looking forward to learning how a focus on ESG excellence, creating a long-term value. Everyone, please welcome Carmen.
Hello, testing. Okay, hello everyone. This is Carmen from SGS. It's honor of me to be invited to speak here. Today, I'll walk you through how sustainability is driving the electronics industry, focusing on product sustainability. So this is the brief agenda. We'll go through some regulatory trends and highlights, including chemicals, and also including the new battery regulation. And then we'll talk a bit into the product carbon footprint and the environmental labeling. But as we have limited time today, I may go through some of the slides quite quickly. So if you have any questions, just feel free to stay and discuss here. For sustainability, under the electronic products context, there are basically three main criteria that define sustainability. First one is that no toxic chemicals should be used in your products. Second is that low carbon emission, or if we use a more updated term, it should be low environmental impact. And third part will be the recyclable or reusable part should be prioritized in your product. So chemicals is the first criteria under the sustainability of electronic products. It actually refers to three sustainability goals under the 17 under the United Nations. So there are the health and well-being, the clean water, and water, life underwater. So why chemicals is related to sustainability? The main reason is that chemicals is used everywhere. So basically in every consumer products, there are chemical use. So chemicals basically interact with the human body and the environment all the times via the usage and also the production. So when countries are setting up legislation, for example, the European Green Deal framework, most legislation will have chemicals as a major part under their strategy. For example, under the European Green Deal, there is chemical strategy for sustainability, which drives a lot of the subsequent legislative changes, like the proposed REACH revision and other battery regulations. In the EU Chemical Management Framework, there are two chemical lists that are essential. The first one requires the communication of chemicals through the supply chain called the SGS. So the first list is on communication. If your product contains chemicals in the list, you can still sell on the market, but you will have to report to the government on the chemicals. Second list is a restriction list, which means when you contain those chemicals listed under the Annex 17, your product is banned from the market, which you will not be able to sell anymore. So for the SGS candidate list, it is updated by twice a year, and it is now 240 chemicals in the list, which you have to communicate if you contain them. And for the Annex 17, it has been updated quite actively in the past year. For example, the lead in PVC is updated, and more importantly, formaldehyde requirement, which impacts all articles into the EU, including electronic products. And there will be a proposed requirement for a group of chemicals called PFAS. So this is the highlight that I want to share more about. For the PFAS requirement, what I want to highlight here is that this chemical is so widely used. And we will have a later section focusing on PFAS alone. And what I want to highlight here is that under the current proposal of EU PFAS restriction, normal electronic products like earphone or battery charger will not have any derogation. There will only be an 18-month of transition period before your product is restricted. Unless you are selling a very sophisticated or specified kind of medical device or a huge systematic construction kind of products, then there may be some derogation. So apart from the EU REACH chemical framework, the US also has its chemical management law called the TSCA. So TSCA is basically an old piece of legislation, and but after its reform in 2016, it has been actively updating its chemical list. So much like the EU REACH framework, there are multiple requirement lists. There is a list for reporting where you have to communicate if you contain those chemicals, and there is a list of restriction as well. For the restriction part, this is only some lines of all the restriction. The list contains a lot of flame retardants, very commonly used in the electronic products. For example, DecaBDE, the first line, and also the second line, PIP 321. PIP 321 is so commonly used in the electronics that the industry actually have voiced out to the government that no, we are not able to immediately phase out those chemicals. So the compliance deadline for PIP 321 has actually postponed a few times. And now the compliance deadline is October this year. Apart from the restriction list, there is also a list called the evaluation list in the US TSCA. So for this list of evaluation, the chemicals are very likely to be restricted in the future because they are prioritized to be evaluated. So there are about 20 chemicals under the evaluation list. A lot of them is flame retardants, again, very commonly used in electronic products. And there are extra some phthalates, which is used as plasticizer in electronic products. So you may have to take note on this list as well because they are very likely to be banned in the future under the US regulation. Apart from the restriction list, as I mentioned, there is also a communication list in the US. So a new requirement from the US EPA is that they issued a finalized rule like October last year that requires all PFAS containing substances to be reported to the EPA. And the reporting time frame is from 2011 up to now. And the scope includes any imported products containing PFAS. So if your product contains PFAS and you have imported to the US in like past 10 years, you will have to make reporting to the US EPA government. And the reporting system will be ready by the end of this year, and your reporting obligation has to be done before May or November next year, depending on your company size. Apart from the regional requirements, as I mentioned, the EU REACH and then the US TSCA, basically there are also global agreements on chemicals. So there are different agreements where nations sit down to communicate their prioritization, and there are different protocol names. For example, Rotterdam Convention is for substance mixture, those liquid chemicals, and the Basel Convention is for waste, chemicals in waste, and there are a lot of others. But we want to focus today the Stockholm Convention. Stockholm Convention focuses on any persistent organic pollutants, which we call the POPs chemicals. And these chemicals are hazardous and can accumulate in our body and is persistent in the environment. So this convention focuses both substance and mixture and all consumer articles, any articles. So countries basically will adopt these international agreements into their own local legislation after the agreement. So we can basically look at the convention to know the next action that will be implemented by the nations. For example, in 2022, a chemical called PFHXS was added to this global convention under the UN. And then last year, 2023, many nations have already banned this PFHXS, so 1 year after the global action. So then in 2023, 3 more chemicals like DP, UE 328, and methoxychlor was added to the list. So you can expect what will be like restricted from the market this year by different nations. Another highlight that I want to make here is that there is a group of chemicals the LCPFCA, which is a smaller family of, again, the PFAS group, is very likely to be put into the elimination list next year. So that is something that you have to be cautious of. As I said, after the international agreement under the Stockholm Convention, basically countries will follow up to make those agreements into their own legislation. So here I just briefly show how different nations is implementing their regulation. So for example, in the EU side, the regulation name is the EU POPs regulation, and it restricts 28 chemicals, somehow similar to the Stockholm Convention. But for the Canadian market, there are much more chemical names on the table proposed to be restricted. For example, on top of the Stockholm Convention list, basically it adds other like DBDPE, another chemical, which their study actually found that more than half of the electronic products contain DBDPE in the Canadian market. And this is a kind of like, again, flame retardants used in electronic products, and they're proposing to restrict them from the market. So you can see that different nations basically have different implementation, action, or the scope of restriction, or even the chemical list after the international agreement of Stockholm Convention. So here are just a few other examples like Australia regulation, Singapore, Japan, China, and even Hong Kong has its own implementation of the POPs chemical regulation. So on and off, we have seen different regulations talking about the PFAS chemical group. So it is a hot topic that you may have already sit for many webinars or seminars in these chemical groups. So what is it? PFAS is a group of chemicals that provide excellent function, non-stick function in different scenarios like waterproof or dustproof or chemical resistant in the battery membrane, etc. So it has excellent physical properties and also excellent durability. Like common fluoropolymers like PTFE is very commonly used in different products like the electronics or textile. But it is in the recent decades, scientific studies have found that this PFAS group is basically affecting the human body and also contaminate the environment. So in ordinary way of thinking, usually we think that the exposure of chemicals to human is mainly based on the use of our consumer products, or when the workers work and they are exposed to some chemicals. So this is the ordinary way of thinking. But actually, after those consumer product is disposed, or during its manufacturing processes, there are many releases to the environment, which under the food and water cycle, it actually goes back to the human body via the food we ingest or the water that we use. So scientific studies have found that PFAS chemical groups, not only in consumer products, but also in the water of the snow peaks when no human reach there. And also they found PFAS in food and even human blood and breast milk. So this exposure is something that we may not have expected in like 20 years ago. So PFAS have become a real concern. Then legislators have proposed them to be restricted under a lot of the new proposals, and because there are so many new PFAS regulations, so three main trends here. First, in the past, PFAS was banned one by one chemical by one chemical. But in the most recent legislation proposals, it will be a group restriction. So the whole PFAS chemical is expected to be restricted in the market, not one by one. So second is that a lot of the agencies like the US federal is actually requiring suppliers to have reporting obligation on the whole PFAS group. And third is that there are also extra requirements by some US states to require like online posting or labeling to inform your customer that there is PFAS. And there are some additional restrictions depending on the product category and different states. So what's the problem of PFAS? There are actually so many upcoming legislation, and because PFAS is a group that contains like 10,000 plus number of chemicals. So conventional way of testing may not suffice the whole PFAS requirement. And that's why a lot of the suppliers may still rely on the declaration of conformity to be made by their upstreams for compliance or to make marketing claims like PFAS-free. So the PFAS-free claim on the market basically somehow makes consumer feel confused. So which claims is true and which is not. So we do provide extra solutions for the PFAS. Like for material testing, we provide comprehensive analytical testing. For finished product, we provide verification services, and we also have certification on PFAS assessed. So apart from the PFAS issue, we also have a lot of other attributes that can get your product certified. For example, like bio-based or biodegradability or recycled contents. And I have to mention that a lot of these certifications are testing based, and there are third-party tested to make extra trust on this, extra credibility on this mark. So this is the deliverables of the green mark, and you will have the product marking that can put on your product. The QR code on the marking will link to the certification behind. So any consumer seeing your product can scan the QR code and understand the certification behind and what's the rationale or requirements behind, so that they will not be confused. So another important update is the battery regulations, which will be an example of how future product legislation will look like. Apart from added restriction or added performance requirement, more importantly is that these new regulation types will actually focus on the life cycle perspective, a new term, life cycle perspective, which goes beyond the sold product itself, but to your whole value chain. So any value chain that makes your products, like the upstream suppliers or even the downstream waste, the producer responsibility will also be included into the new requirements in upcoming new product legislation. So battery is only the first one. There are many more product legislation upcoming in other product categories. So we take a look what is life cycle. So life cycle basically consider your products from cradle to grave. So the cradle is the material acquisition, and follow that is the production, and then distribution of use, and then the end of life. So the whole life cycle will be considered in upcoming future product legislation. So for example, for the battery regulation, there are requirements on the value chain due diligence policy on your supply chain, which requires environmental and social criteria of your value chain. And also there will be requirements on recycled content and carbon footprint of battery. So along the life cycle, there are also battery passport requirements on the battery. And in the use, there are performance and removability requirements. And also, as the final stage of waste, there are also extended producer responsibility, which you have to fulfill under the new regulation. So these are two slides of solution, which we can help with the comprehensive consolidated arrangement of your compliance to battery. So for example, restricted substance or the conformity assessment and the due diligence policy. Also, for other battery types, there are carbon footprint or recycled content requirement, which we also provide relevant service to help with. So I will not go into details of each of these services. Just if you are interested to know more, just get in touch. So we have talked a lot about the product regulation. So what's the point? we want to show you that there are three main trends of future product legislation that you have to be aware of. So first thing is on chemicals. The restriction will be in a group basis, not one by one. So apart from PFAS, there are also other group restrictions under discussion of like EU authorities, for example, the brominated flame retardants or the bisphenols. So there are a lot of chemicals that will be banned as a whole family, which you may not get enough confidence by just conventional testing. So second trend about the chemicals is that apart from the restricted substance, there are also long list of declarable substance. For example, in the EU battery regulation, it requires you to disclose the hazardous substance used in your battery. And that hazardous substance basically refers to another regulation that contains thousands of chemicals. So you will not be able to test them all. You will have to sort for alternative way to gather information in your supply chain, like Patrick just said. And the second trend is that there will be more and more product claims that you are mandated to provide to consumer. For example, the carbon footprint and the environmental impact, you will have to disclose those environmental attributes in your products soon. And those claims that you make to your consumer are required to be explicit and verifiable. And last point is that like battery regulation or the new product regulation will require life cycle thinking. You no longer focus only on your product, but also on your supply chain and also the waste stream. You have to focus the extended producer responsibility. So this is here comes the second point of the sustainability of electronic products, that is the low carbon emission requirement, or like I just said, the updated term should be low environmental impact. Because apart from carbon emission, there are, which for climate change, we also have other environmental impacts like water resource use or ecotoxicity. So why do we have to focus on carbon footprint of products? There are basically many factors that drive this. In the past, it may be only the goodwill of companies' performance, but there are more and more upcoming legislation that requires you to disclose product carbon footprint. For example, the EU CBAM, the carbon border tax, and also the updated EU regulations, like I just said. And there is a proposed regulation called the ESPR, the Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulations, which is expected to be adopted by this year by the European Parliament. So that will place extra requirement for you to disclose your product's environmental footprint, including carbon footprint of your product to the consumer. So you will have to get advanced preparation for that. Apart from the regulatory driver, there are also marketing drivers. The carbon footprint is now a common requirement for a lot of the buyers, especially if you are doing public procurement for government or public authorities. The requirement of putting carbon footprint to your product is now a common requirement for those public procurement. And there are also some online retails that provides prioritization in the online platform for your products if you are certified with carbon footprint or other environmental attributes. And the third point that carbon footprint could help is that it can help to identify the hotspot of your product so that you can do pinpoint improvement to the product's environmental attributes. And also the quantification of carbon footprint of product can help you to prepare more accurate Scope 3 reporting for corporate carbon as well. So here is an introduction of the carbon footprint, a little bit of the concepts for you to understand. So a few vocabulary here. So we usually say carbon footprint. So what is carbon footprint? Carbon footprint basically quantifies the greenhouse gas emission caused by your product. So greenhouse gas, when in excess, it causes climate change. So climate change is only one of the environmental impacts among the different like I just said, apart from climate change or carbon footprint, we also have like water resource use, biodiversity, or ecotoxicity, or different environmental impacts. So it is only one of those impacts. When quantifying the carbon footprint of a product, an approach called the LCA, the life cycle perspective, life cycle assessment will have to be used. So in the life cycle assessment, we will assess the product's processes from cradle to grave. So again, it's raw material, and then the production, distribution, use, and the end of life. All those stages of a product will be considered for the greenhouse gas emission. And the third one, the product category rules. What is product category rules? Like when company A quantified its carbon footprint and it takes into account one processes, if in the same time company B is not quantifying that process so that they can include that process and resulting in a less carbon emission, that will not be fair. So for a lot of those product categories, there will be some rules made to mandate which should be included in your consideration and what's not. So that's called the product category rules when quantifying carbon footprints. The process will basically involve the data collection in your supply chain for what you can control. And for those the supplier cannot have control and cannot have data, we then use the database system to fulfill those data gaps and prepare the study report. And finally, after the study is finished, there should be an external verifier to verify the study so that all calculation methodologies are correct. And we'll look into battery regulation as an example of how the compliance in carbon footprint will be in the future. So in battery regulation, the first type of categories that have to comply with the carbon footprint requirement will be EV. EV stands for electric vehicle. So in next year, the electric vehicles batteries will have to provide carbon footprint labeling. And after EV, there will be industrial batteries which have the same requirements, and these industrial batteries will also include any consumer battery heavier than 5 kgs. So if you have a consumer battery heavier than 5 kg, it should be counted into industrial batteries and comply with carbon footprint requirement as well. And after that, it will also apply on the batteries for LMT, standing for the light means of transport, like scooters. And the requirement will apply phase by phase. So the first step in the European action, it will require the labeling of carbon footprint. And afterwards, they will classify those batteries into different gradings of carbon footprint, like the energy labeling. So it classifies what is good and what is bad. And finally, it will set a threshold value to phase out those worst performing batteries from their European market. So that's for carbon footprint, and then we'll go into the recyclable or reusable part. So basically, most electronic products in many regions has its own stream of electronic waste. So more problems actually lies on the packaging part. First is the packaging material itself, and second is the instruction or the wordings used on the packaging to show that the electronic products is recyclable. So two things. So this slide is just to show that the low recycling rate of of packaging materials, which actually triggers the EU nations to make its own law to boost the recycling rate. So the requirements shown in this slide is just the corner of an iceberg among the vast amount of requirements in the European or in the world market. So we do provide services to help you consolidate those requirements on packaging labeling. Just feel free to reach us if you are interested in this service. For time limitation, I have gone through some of those chemicals requirements quite quickly. So we do have webinars on coming Wednesday on chemicals requirements. So we'll go more deeply into those chemical requirements. We here invite you to join our webinar by just scanning the QR code and register. So that's for my part today. Thank you very much.